We're going to look at a characteristic called resilience, which is a particular definition of optimism. Optimism doesn't necessarily mean just hoping for the best. It's a way of looking at life in general. Entrepreneurs can be their own worst enemies. This is from an article called The Dark Side of Entrepreneurship by a long-standing researcher named Ketz de Vries. So some of the characteristics that can get in the way of entrepreneurial success are, if you like, the dark side of the characteristics that help entrepreneurship. There's a need for control. Yes, you need to take charge of your own destiny, but if you're unable to delegate, then it's going to impede your ability to get other people involved, and you're going to need other people if you're going to succeed in anything but a very small business. A sense of distrust. This is the, if you like, the dark side of the locus of control, the internal locus of control. You feel that you can carve your path in life, but you don't want to let other people get involved because they may not do things. So that can lead to a distorted point of view and withholding of information. One of the things that we will talk about in this unit is the value of sharing your idea, your business idea, your business opportunity with other people, rather than keeping it to yourself. The reason for that is that you have so much more to gain by getting feedback from people, which you will only get if you share your ideas, than by keeping it all to yourself, where you are deliberately cutting yourself off from any of the reality checks that might alert you to the fact that your idea has flaws. Desire for applause or validation of success. If you need other people to tell you you're being successful, then it's going to hold you back from being successful on your own terms. This is a really difficult thing to get hold of, and many adults, and I count myself in my 50s in that, we kind of need other people to notice that we're being successful, to say, hey, you did a good job there. But you've got to learn to judge yourself by your own standards. And then finally, defensiveness. I see this all the time when people present a business idea to a panel and the panel asks them questions. So what defensive entrepreneurs do is they'll start to explain why the person who asked the question is wrong. What good entrepreneurs will do is say, that's a really good question, and they will proceed to answer it in a good way, or they may be, if they don't have a good answer, go, you've made a good point there, I'm going to look into that. And you may, in that process, get somebody who will actually help you with that because they've got information that you need. They've got connections that you can use. Entrepreneurship does involve risk, all sorts of risk. People worry about losing money. One reason it's good to start young when you don't have much to lose is that you limit the financial risk. There's career risk. This is one of the things that prevents older people from starting their own business because perhaps they've already got a reasonable job. Family and social risk. Sometimes your friends and family think you're crazy to be thinking of starting your own business, and you want them to continue to think well of you. So there's that reputational risk. And there's also the psychological risk that it is a stressful occupation and that can take a toll on you. But there are ways of dealing with that. So, what do you do to guard yourself, to mitigate against these risks? Well, the psychological risk, one of the things that you can do is to develop resilience. Two key traits that, this came to me from a business journalist who'd spent a lot of time interviewing entrepreneurs. And what he said he noticed was that they were creative and they were resilient. And I've changed the wording on those slightly. One of the things I observe about good entrepreneurs is their creativity comes from curiosity. They're always interested in new ideas. They're interested in learning from others. They're interested in exploring better solutions. And if you're curious about something, it actually reduces your defensiveness. So that's a valuable thing. Resilience is the ability to move on and recover from setbacks, as we've just been talking about. So here's some definitions of a person recovering easily and quickly from misfortune or illness, of an object capable of regaining its original shape. We talk about people being able to bounce back, ability to thrive, mature, increase competence in the face of adverse circumstances. Some entrepreneurs, and think about this as you're reading about and writing about entrepreneurs or interviewing entrepreneurs, have actually come from very, very difficult circumstances. They may have had adverse circumstances early on in their life, and this has framed the way they look at things. So why is it important? Here's a quote from a famous motivational speaker, that the quality of your life is in direct proportion to the amount of uncertainty you can comfortably deal with. I can sympathise with liking certainty. Like many people, I like to know what's going to happen in the future, and I'm disconcerted when I don't know what's going to happen. Most of us are. Entrepreneurs have to be able to deal with uncertainty and to be able to live with the discomfort that brings about. So one of the ways of dealing with that is to develop an optimistic outlook. And part of that is that you can actually recover from things that go wrong. Martin Seligman, who's a very well-known psychologist, has written a book called Learned Optimism. That's just one of the many books that he's written. And he's looked at optimism and pessimism. And he's observed that the difference between them is how you explain events to yourself. Let's look at that in more detail. Optimists and pessimists explain things in different ways along three key dimensions. Permanence is, how long will this affect me for? Is it going to be just a one-off, or is it going to be forever? Pervasiveness is how much of my life does this affect? Does it just affect the very small context in which an event happened, or does it affect the whole of my life? Then there's personalisation. Who's responsible? Whose fault was it? Was it me? Was it somebody else? So optimists and pessimists have different approaches to good and bad events. Here's a summary. An optimist will look at a good event and say, hey, good things always happen to me. I'm a lucky person. And they happen to me in every part of my life. So every time a good thing happens, they go, yeah, that's the way my life is. A bad event, you know what? Bad things happen to optimists just as much as pessimists. But optimists think, oh, that was just a one-off. It's not likely to happen again. Wasn't anything I did. Doesn't affect anything else in my life. So they focus on the good events and they minimise the bad events. Pessimists are the opposite way around. Pessimists tend to think the good events were just a lucky chance and aren't likely to happen again. And bad events are pervasive. They always happen to me in every part of my life, and it's me who makes it happen. Now, trigger warning here. The description of a pessimist, if it becomes seriously pessimistic, is also the description of somebody who may be suffering from depression. So if this discussion triggers any of those thoughts, please do refer to the counselling service that's available from Swinburne. The good news is that your thinking style can be adapted. So, what Martin Seligman says is people who make permanent and universal explanations for their troubles tend to collapse under pressure. In other words, they're not resilient. However, it doesn't have to be that way. You can change the way you look at good and bad events. So, for example, when something bad happens, then assume it won't last long. Look to see what isn't affected. Often when something bad happens, you feel like it's painted everything in your life black, but in actual fact, it probably only affects a few things. And don't tell yourself that it was all your fault. Hey, if you contributed to it, then maybe you've learned something that you won't do again. But nothing is ever entirely your fault. When good things happen, hey, bank that. Put that in your store of I can do good things. Take it out and look at it when you're feeling a bit low. Feel that if good things can happen in one part of your life, they can happen in other parts of your life as well. And look to see what you did that contributed to it, and how you can build on that to contribute to things and build things and make things happen for you in the future. One of the ways of changing your explanatory style is the ABCDE. And if any of you have studied psychology or ever visited a counsellor or done some reading from self-help books, this is pretty much cognitive behaviour therapy. It's looking at the way you think about things. It's well established. It doesn't work for everybody, but it helps you to challenge your way of thinking. It's pretty simple. You look at an adverse event, something that went wrong, and be very specific about it. You look at what went through your head when it happened. And you try and be as accurate as possible. What words did you say to yourself in your mind, or maybe even out loud? The consequence of those beliefs. How did those words that you said to yourself, those beliefs that you noticed, how did it make you feel and how did it make you act? So that's the first bit, focusing on the event itself. So when you've got that clear, go, well, hang on a minute. Is that true? Challenge the beliefs or find evidence. I always do this. I always mess up. Do you? Can you think of at least one example where you didn't do something wrong? Well, in that case, it's not always, is it? That's the sort of thing. And finally, just notice how this disputation has changed your energy or mood. Now, this may work really well for you, or you may have to practice it, or you may find that there are other ways of dealing with it. This is just a suggestion from the Seligman book. The important thing is that we can adjust our attitudes to life, and a certain amount of optimism and belief that we can make things happen is useful for people who plan to be an entrepreneur. So, if there are all these advantages to being optimistic, what's the use of pessimism? And there are advantages to being optimistic. These are all from Seligman's research. Optimistic people tend to be happier, they tend to be healthier and longer living, they tend to get things done, and they tend to see possibilities rather than problems. But pessimists have one major advantage over optimists, and that's objectivity. Seligman's research has shown that pessimists see actual facts more objectively than optimists. So a lovely example of this research is that he gave a group of people a test which was rigged so that they could only get 50% of the answers right. They would get exactly 50% correct. And he pre-tested people to see if they were optimistic or pessimistic thinkers. Now the pessimists, as you might predict, they predicted their results pretty accurately. And by the way, people knew how many questions they got right. They marked them as they went along. But unless you were counting them, you wouldn't necessarily work that out. The pessimists could accurately say, yeah, we got about 50% right. The extreme optimists would insist that they got about 70% right, even though everybody got 50% wrong. So, perhaps every team should contain a pessimist, just as a reality check. Takeaways from this? Entrepreneurship involves setbacks, but hey, so does life in general. To succeed, you need to be able to recover from setbacks, and this ability is known as resilience. Now, people tend to have different levels of resilience, but resilience can be developed. And one of the ways to develop it is through optimistic thinking. Notice, this does not mean blind optimism. Going out into the future and saying everything will turn out right without actually doing anything about it is not the same as resilience or optimistic thinking. Another way of developing resilience is to be prepared to move outside your comfort zone. And that's one of the things you'll have an opportunity to practice in this unit. So, think about optimism. Think about resilience. What do you notice about yourself and other people?